Hello everyone. I just want to remind you that no matter what you're going through now, and no matter how dark it seems, there's always going to be brighter days that will come after it. You have to keep your head up, stay in the fight, and you can handle it. I believe in you. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Make sure you check out my Instagram at Joe the Insomniac and the podcast in the description below. Take care. I grew up in Ohio in the 70s, and me and my childhood friend Joe, one hell of a name, were outside all the time when we could manage it. Joe, the real G, lived on a farm that bordered a pretty big forest, and my parents would drop me off in the morning and we'd stay in the woods all weekend. We'd only come out for school. We loved pretending that we're frontiersmen. We'd build lots of traps, shelters, and practice making fires with sticks. Basically the whole 9 yards. Now when we got to high school, we got this notion to pull a Stand By Me. This was based on the movie of the same name that had just come out. The idea was that we'd walk the rail tracks out in the country, but instead of looking for a dead body, we'd find a cool bridge to fish from, and camp out a little way off the track. Of course, we knew this was dangerous and we're probably trespassing, but we're young and kids. Now we had a lot of fun. We did find beautiful rivers. We discovered bridges that nobody went on. We fished, hid from trains, and at night we camped in the woods near the tracks and made small hidden fires. Nothing bad ever happened. It was very calm actually. Now after school, me and Joe went our own ways. We both left home, but always stayed in touch and always tried to coordinate visits so we'd occasionally see each other. Well, one summer in the mid-90s, it worked out that we're both in the same town for about a week. We'd do other stuff with family in the day, and at night, we'd either catch drinks at the bar or sit outside Joe's house around a fire and talk about the old days. One night, me and Joe got to talking about our Stand By Me trips. Well, nostalgia and beer and a hell of a mix. Soon we decided to take a day just to walk the trails, camp one night and walk home. The day we decided on, we started out early in the morning. We actually had my wife drop us off in the old spot we used to start in, right outside our hometown. She thought this was absolutely crazy and made sure to mention it. When she pulled away, Joe suggested that instead of walking the usual route, we take the opposite direction, just to be adventurous. We knew the land well. We had a map, so I gave her what the hell, and off we set. The day went fine. It was fun and a little sad, but in a good way. We sat on the bridge and moved on. We had no fishing gear, but we brought some canned food and other stuff before the night set in. We picked a spot to camp in. It was a thick forested area, trees on every side of the train track, and it made you feel as though you're in a tunnel. We brought small hammocks to sleep on, but before we set them up, we decided to scout the perimeter. Now this is actually what we used to do in the old days. We'd walk the area and make sure that we're not just on some guy's house or something. We walk maybe 100 feet or so into the woods and end up on a small incline. We figured if we don't see anything from the top of this hill, we'll be good. But when we get to the top of the hill, we saw an old building down at the bottom, about 100 yards into the woods, which is barely visible. We pondered over what to do. We both assumed it was a sugar shack or something, because there didn't appear to be a clear road into it. From where we were, there didn't appear to be anyone in it. It was quiet, with no movement that we can see. No lights even. We decided to walk a little closer just to make sure. We came down the hill very slowly as we neared the building, and we see it's not a sugar shack, but it's an old church. It looked as though it had been abandoned for years. It was a squat, sagging building with wooden planks that are busting out from years of moss and rot. A cross still stood on top of that place. also weathered and black, looking creepy. None of the windows had glass and there were no doors, just open doorways. We got close enough to see the inside. There were rows of pews and a built-up section for a preacher to stand on. We didn't go all the way in. We didn't wanna. Beyond all that, there were no signs of anyone, not even footprints. It was an abandoned church. We left immediately and went back up the hill to our spot, and we decided to camp there. Having a hill between us and the church made us feel safe, but we're still a little uneasy. We chalk it up to the natural creepiness of seeing a church in the middle of the woods in the middle of nowhere. Besides, at this point it's dusk and we decide to rig up our hammocks and go to sleep. By this time night set in. Now as we lay in our hammocks, we're talking and we hear something in the direction of the church. What the hell's that? It sounds like people singing. Yeah, I know, man. And it did sound like people singing. We both slid right out of our hammocks and hunkered down, straining to hear more. We listened for a minute or two, and they're singing, but it's not getting louder. We decide to creep back up the hill to see if we can spy on whatever that is. We could move very quietly in the woods. We're used to it from before and it's like second nature now. The moon was barely out and it provided just enough light so you couldn't really see us. We didn't touch our flashlights as we slowly got up the hill, not even whispering. We got to the top of the hill and we see a light in the distance. It was coming from the church. Singing? Well, it's from inside. Joe and I put our heads close together and hushed conversations to each other. Can you hear this? I don't believe this. Craziest thing is that the light appears as though it's coming from a candle and flickering. And though we tried, we can't make out what's being sung. It sounded like church music but in another language. We sat there for a while, trying to see who was in there, but only saw occasional shadows. We have no intention of getting closer. We have about a football field's length between us now. The singing has continued for a bit, but stopped. After that, a booming male voice began to chant. I'm already freaked out, but this voice scared the life out of me. It sounded like an Old Testament preacher that you see in movies, but again, speaking in another language, we can't differentiate any words. Eventually, it got to where the single male voice would say something, then a bunch of voices would answer. This lasted for a while, then they all broke out into the song, which is long and sustained and gets louder and louder. It got so loud it was actually disturbing enough that I covered my ears. It stopped now. At this point, I was getting ready to say, let's get out of here, when Joe puts his hand on my shoulder and says, yeah, they're coming. We're far enough away that we can't make them out really, but we can literally see a line of figures walking out of the hallway, all in single file. Some of them have flashlights and began to sing again. They're moving towards us. We booked it back down to our campsite, grabbed our stuff and ran to the tracks. Once there, we ran down the tracks into the direction we come from. After a few minutes, we stopped and looked back. We saw lights coming down the hill, erratically like they're shaking them. We sprint as quick as we can. We eventually stop seeing the lights and come to our road, but our map is really small and we're struggling to read it. We walk for about 15 more minutes and know where we are. We get to a gas station and my wife gets us. Now my wife and other friends say it's just kids messing around, but there was no way kids made them sounds. Not sure who these people were, but it definitely creeps me out. I remember that happening to me in Ohio. I'm doing seasonal work out in the Olympic National Park this summer and live in employee housing on the same property as my job. Throughout the summer, I've heard things like a giggling coming from an empty room and a sliding door that closes on its own. Now one night about a month ago, something wild happened. The building I live in is backed up against an impenetrable coastal rainforest, and some friends and I were sitting in one of the apartment unit cabins chatting when, all of a sudden, we hear screaming coming from directly in the woods. Initially, we thought it's a cougar, but it kept going and was decidedly human sounding. Sometimes it seemed more like a sobbing, and in others it was frantic yelling. It literally goes on for 5 minutes straight, then stops. Now the truly chilling part, about 30 seconds after the yelling stops, we heard what sounded like a disembodied woman's voice coming through a radio that starts muttering right next to where we're sitting. We can't make out what she's saying, and it's only for a few seconds, but it's literally in the room next to us, and we can't see anything around. One of my friends opens the door to make sure there's nobody outside, and we're completely alone. It should be added that everyone who lives in the buildings were all in the same room. Everything else was empty. Though the voice lasted for a few seconds, it stayed with me forever. When I was about 9, my family was in a big transitional phase. We moved out to a house deep in the woods in the country, and my mother to this day insists that it's haunted. My sleepwalking got really bad in those days, I mean incredibly. Sometimes I'd wake up on dirt, outside, with a blanket wrapped around me. I would look around in darkness for a light, and that would usually be my house porch light. It got so bad that my mum kind of barricaded me in at night with chairs sometimes. What scared me most, however, was not outside in the woods, near the national forest, no. It was my room. It was on the first floor, and with the layout of the house, it was on a silent kind of slanted hill. It dug into the ground a bit. It was the closest thing to a basement possible, because it dug into the ground. There was only one window in my room. This window is in the top right corner of my room, and it was tiny. The window was right at ground level outside, so most of the time I would only see thick grass and dirt covering the glass. Sometimes when I woke up in the night though, I would see other things. Often, I saw boots standing there. They would stand there for hours at a time, facing inwards as though someone's staring at the wall, facing me. They were steel-toed, or looked like old leather boots. It looked as if they belonged to a man. It was so weird. The boots shifted weight sometimes back and forth, between one side and the other, as though the wearers lean in. The toe area was always scuffed too. I knew that they weren't my mother's or father's. It wasn't sleeping paralysis. I was always able to move in that. I would just sit and stare at these boots until I fell asleep. And for some reason, I always had the urge to never go and tell someone, and I don't know why. My family's already freaking out about the other experiences in the house, so I guess I didn't want to add to it. It stopped when my dad moved. Years later, and with the family camping, and all of us are telling scary stories, my father begins talking about how when he was young, he would have the sensation that something was slowly walking towards him. Has anyone ever seen it in a movie? Yeah, like that. He just explained like a pair of shoes that slowly walked towards him with malevolent intent. He goes on to explain how it stopped when he got older. I get this sour taste in my mouth. I ask my father if they're still toes. He shoots this weird look at me and nods. I say, are they made of old, dusted leather and scuffed at the front? He looks scared now and nods. He said, how do I know? And I explain my story, and he begins freaking out. It was so insane to make these realizations at the same time. And my father's room was right above mine, so someone with average height at that specific spot would have been right through to my dad's window. I've concluded that my father has spirits that follow him. I now know that they weren't there for me. I just hope they can stop. It was mid-December 2010. I was 16. I was off school for the half term and was playing video games all day basically. I lived in a small 3-bedroom semi-detached house. Due to my bedroom being upstairs and fairly small, my mum let me have the back room downstairs as my room too. This had all things in there like my PC, reptiles and guitars. We also had some doors leading into the garden near the forest. One night at around 2 AM, I was playing World of Warcraft and using Ventural talking to my guide friends. Pretty standard night. At the time, my sleeping pattern was awful and I was staying awake all night playing World of Warcraft. I pretty much always had my back door a little tiny bit open to let some cool air in, due to the heat coming off my computer and to cool it too. This had never been a problem. We lived in a relatively quiet area. Now our garden backs onto a small wooded area, and the only people I ever seen in there were kids making dens and playing etc. Nothing really to be scared of. While having headphones in, I can't really hear anything outside, because of the game volume I mean. I remembered playing and catching something out of the corner of my eye. Now my PC desk is about 3 feet away from the double doors against the wall. Anybody outside would be able to see me sitting at the desk. I turned and saw a hand opening the door. I froze and remembered spinning around in my chair ripping out my headphones. This would be a pretty good time to add that I was home alone. My mum and dad were at a wedding party and I was fine staying home on my own. Then a man, who's about 30 years old with a shaved head and scruffy beard, is standing at my door. Well, we kind of stare at each other for a few seconds and I ask him to close my door and get out of the garden. But he just casually walked in and stood there. I remembered freaking out a little and standing up and moving to the other side of the room. I moved towards a shelf where I had a penknife and took it out and tell him to go away. He then said that, and it chills me, he knew nobody was home and says let me stay on the couch until my parents' car shows up. I'm freaked the hell out. He got visibly agitated and starts walking around my room looking at my reptiles. I told him that I'm gonna call the police. I remember not being as terrified as I should have been. It was only for the reason what the situation is that I couldn't really understand what was going on. He then said something along the lines of, "You know, I'll stab you long before the police ever get here." I remember then going out to my room and shutting the door behind me, so he's locked in. I never heard him walk to the door or even try the handle. He then starts really pushing on it while screaming at me to move. I weigh up my options. It seemed like the best option would be to run out of the front door and knock on the neighbour's house, but my very small dog was asleep in the bedroom and I'm not going to leave him. I know my dad kept a police cosh in the cupboard in his bedroom, so I sprinted to get it. While rustling in the drawers, I hear him going upstairs. He's now making his way through my parents' bedroom, staring at me through the banister. I'm terrified. He has a steak knife in his hands now, which I didn't see before, and he raises it up to me. I had the cosh and a penknife, but I wasn't confident. He didn't move for a bit until I asked him what he planned to do because this isn't going to end well for us. He told me he's going to go back and walk down the stairs. I heard him go through my room. I hear him slowly go through the other side. I crept back down the stairs, but what made it more intense is for some reason he turned off every single light. Before I got to the bottom of the stairs, I called the police watching the doors to see if he'd come. The police arrived 10 minutes later and my parents shortly after. They searched the woods behind my house and the fencing area, and they found some used needles, gloves, and a huge carpet roll, and about 10 cigarettes in the same place. They suggested he must have been watching me in the dark because it would have a perfect view of my room. And what's worst, they never found him. So this is something that I've kept to myself for over 2 years now, and every time I think about it, all the hairs on my body stand up. Here's something that my girlfriend and I really like to try and forget about. So my girlfriend and I really enjoyed trying to find new hikes in western Colorado. We decided to try a new trail that was not on the national monument, and was far away from any other trail. Was a good deal with the way out of town as well. Anyway, we're on one of the only car parks on the trailhead, and as soon as we're walking it gets really dark. Well, we make it all the way until the moon rose, and I stop to hug my girlfriend. Now all of a sudden, further down the road, at least a few miles away, we hear automatic gunfire. It pops, then goes silent, then pops again. Now this kind of thing isn't normal in my area. Now my girlfriend said to me if she thought they were gunshots, and I say I don't think they are. Now we're in the middle of the wilderness at this point. We decided it'd be best to turn back about 2 miles down the trail. Now by this moment we're on top of a very large hill covered in desert shrubs. As soon as we stop talking, we realise something's wrong. All of the insects had stopped chirping, and the crickets had stopped entirely. All of the sounds of nature were gone. My girlfriend was facing further down the trail, and I was facing back the way we come from. She looked behind me and screams. She then starts running. I was already scared, but I figured the worst it could be is some drunk idiot. I turned and looked, and I immediately ran after her. I never ran so fast in my life. The shrubs are about 2 or 3 feet high in varying spots, and when I turned around, I don't know how to describe it, it looks more like a shadow. Even with the moonlight directly shining on it, it's almost absence of any light. Now it's already starting to stand up when I turn around. As soon as it fully rose up, I realised that I was looking up at this thing, and it had to be at least a foot taller than me. It had very clear skin, and bones that don't appear to be human. We sprinted back to my car, still with the whole trail being silent. I was in such a hurry when we ran to the car that neither of us realised that I hadn't taken out my keys to open the car. We're halfway through the drive when we realised that. Now every single hair on my body was raised, and even if I'm being honest, I've never felt anything like it. Every fibre of my body told me to get out of there, and I was almost paralysed by fear that washed over me. Does anyone know what this could have been? My family owns a lot of land, and on this land we often have problems with squatters. My dad and one of my friends and I would all go out to check out places where apparently people were staying that shouldn't be. I mean, we had more than enough private property signs, and they're just annoying, especially if they're potentially doing lawless activities on our property. So one night, we have such an event. Someone's been sleeping in one of our cabins. Yes, it's derelict, but it's ours, and apparently they look like they're crackheads. Ah, great. Not only have we got to clear it up, but we're also going to have to take out some drugs so nobody or any of our animals can get hurt on them. Unfortunately for us, we have to check it out quick, because my mum's getting really worried, and nightfall's about to set, which only makes it worse for us. We walk up there, and we're just having a laugh, saying, I hope they're not armed, because I know that we are. All of us have rifles on us, and my dad has a shotgun. If it comes to it, heck, we're gonna light them up. I'm not gonna take any risks, and the law's not gonna be on their side if they're already breaking the law but also trespassing on our property. We get in there, and it's quiet. Just too quiet. My dad said he's gonna go outside for a cigarette. I decide to join him. We're really confused because we had seen them a couple of nights ago. They must still be around here. Eventually all of us are outside. I turn my back on the cabin for 1 second and I hear a loud pitched scream. It makes me drop my cigarette. I look around and can't find the source of the sound. We all have our hands on our weapons. We now see a faint glow behind us. I suddenly have this warm feeling. I'm not one to believe in the paranormal, but it's strange. I turn round and to my horror, the entire cabin's been set on fire. I mean, not like a normal natural fire you could start with even a match, like the whole thing had been doused in gasoline. Like somebody was waiting for us to stay in there, heard the door close, and then tried to burn us alive. We never actually found out who did this, but my god, would we have let them have it if we found them. We called the police, but unfortunately, as the cabin had burnt down, there was no evidence in there, and the case remains unsolved to this day. This is my mum's story that happened when she's about 18 years old. Back then she lived in a small town in Germany, and she would go on bike tours frequently. This particular day, she wanted to ride the bike to the forest, have a picnic there and ride back home. She had done that a bunch of times and said it wasn't an unsafe place to be, and she would always set up her stuff near the road, just in case. Anyway, when she almost got to the spot she usually goes, there's a boy fixing his bike. My mum said he's maybe 14. My mum wasn't on the bike anymore. She was wheeling it because she was almost there. When passing the guy, he jumps her, and the next thing she knows, she's face down on the ground. She instantly starts yelling at him to get off and what are you doing? He instantly gets up, but my mum takes the opportunity to get the hell out of there. My mum didn't call the cops or anything because, well, nothing happened. This isn't all though. Fast forward 4 or 5 years on, a few towns over, this guy's on the news for murder. He would wait for women in the park, pounce on them and kill them. My mum was just glad that this happened when she was younger, because if he was older he might have been stronger and managed to get her dead in the forest. I like primitive camping, and me and my wife go out sometimes by ourselves. We usually bring the dog and spend a couple of nights. This time we invited some friends for drinking. Anyway, on the first day, we heard a vehicle coming down the road. Not odd. There are maybe 10 sites or more several miles down the road. It's a dirt road, with nothing there but these primitive sites. One way in and one way out. What's odd though, is that the vehicle that they see is a meat packing truck. It was old, really old, and the lettering was faded. It was faded in beige. None of us really made out the person driving it. There were no plates on the back either. So we all get creeped out collectively, but kind of decide it's not too weird. Maybe they're just renting it out for the cheap. Flash forward to the morning. My mum calls. She's panicking, freaking out, Apparently, some hikers were literally abducted within a few miles of us. There are several girls out at our site too, and my mum's convinced it was the people we saw. I wasn't 100% certain, so pull out my GPS. It was less than half a mile from where we were. I don't remember much of what happened after, but we got the hell out of there. When I was a kid, I grew up at a campground. I'd literally spend the whole summer there, as a relative managed it and worked night security, so I'd been camping throughout my life. On my 21st birthday, some buddies and I decided to go on a trip and do some real camping away in the bush. We Google Mapsed a nice spot near a river along the coast of Lake Superior, out of our way. It was only a few hours to boat there, and we would canoe along the beach for a few miles to get to this spot. We're talking real remote. The nearest road was 5 miles away, and other than trekking through the woods, the only way to get there would be to go back the way we come from, along the beach. So we set up camp near dark, got a nice fire going, and just drank for a few hours. So around midnight, we're all getting tired. After all the paddling and stuff, we were pretty ready to get our tents out. Now, even though I've been camping my whole life, I'm still a light sleeper. I can hear something moving around outside the tents normally. Now right now, I hear heavy footsteps. They're clearly from shoes. I assume it's not an animal, I mean obviously, but it's just one of my friends going to use the bathroom. Even though I don't hear any zipper sounds to the tent, the steps begin to slowly fade away towards the beach. After about 20 minutes or so, I forget about them and begin to drift off to sleep. The next morning, we all get up and start making breakfast and collecting wood. The walking never comes up and we carry on. Now later in the day, we all head to the river to do some fishing and split off into groups. I'm fishing with the friend in the tent next to mine when the other guys split off. He starts saying if I heard anything last night. I tell him about the footsteps and he nods. He then tells me that about an hour after they walked off, they came back. I mention to him that it's probably someone from camp, and he tells me that he doesn't think so because they never went to the tent. He says that the steps walked past the tent, then carried on into the woods. Now jump forward to the last day of the trip. No steps are heard, all throughout the week. Until last night. We're all settled in nice and early, and we have to pack up our stuff and paddle back. And about half an hour in, I can hear steps off at the back edge of the clearing again. They're kind of faint, but as I can start to hear them more clearly, they picked up the pace until they're at full run. And they storm past all the tents into the beach again. We're talking full sprint like you're running for your life, and it's loud as hell. This time, everyone wakes up and climbs out of their tents, flashlights and everything. We all jump out, but there's literally no signs whatsoever that anybody ran here. The soil in the area is fairly soft. If it was a deer or bear, there's going to be clear footprints, but a human? That would definitely leave some. Not even the grass was disturbed. I've never seen anything like it. Being in such a remote area, I really think it must have been something paranormal. Nobody got any sleep after that. We all pack up our stuff except the chairs, and wait around the fire until the sun comes up, paranoid and ready. One of my buddies suggested it could be a Wendigo, but I don't know. scared the life out of me. My family owned lots of swampland, and we had small cabins set up on some of these, because it could be really nice as a getaway sometimes. There's something about being out in nature which is just so relaxing and nice. All of that changed one day, however. When I was about 14, me and my best friend stayed in the cabin. We mostly played video games and just had a good laugh. One night there was a really big thunderstorm, and we had to retreat from the cabin to get back inside. Now the next morning, my friend looked out the window and said, "Oh, I thought we were staying in the closest one to us." I said, "What are you talking about? We were." He said, "No, we couldn't have been." I looked out the window, and to my amazement, the cabin was no longer there. I then rushed downstairs to tell my dad, wondering what on earth has happened, and my mum meets me halfway up the stairs saying, "You're not going to believe what's happened. The ground that was underneath the cabin you two boys were staying in has collapsed, and the cabin's gone." To this day, it's one thing that's horrified me more than anything. The fact that we were so close to danger and didn't even know it. Heck, nobody knew it. I always loved the chance to get out into national forests and parks. I really like jogging. I find a true tranquility when I'm going through them with nothing but the cool summer's air with me. I would do it in winters too, but it was a lot worse because obviously the leaves were very slippery and you wouldn't always see people about outside of the occasional park ranger. But this story took place on one summer's evening. I was feeling really good. I made a playlist and was listening to some podcasts while I was jogging. I set out at about 9 PM, so it was still kind of light outside. As I was jogging, I couldn't help become more and more aware of how dark it seemed to be getting, quick, and I mean almost too quick. I'd go on my phone for literally less than 5 minutes, and when I looked up, it got noticeably darker. Not just in the sense of my eyes adjusting. I mean, it was a weird feeling. And I feel like somebody's watching me. I decide just to try and walk back because I'm getting really tired now, which is another strange thing. I've come to realise it might have been my body's response to fear, but I felt drained and really tired in a way that I've never felt it before. I decide to press on regardless. Cycle through my songs and feel good again. Now as I'm walking, I realise that there's a mist that's setting over the park. Now this is something that I've never experienced before. Well, I have, just not in the summertime, so it's something that I found very strange. I start to hear interference with my headphones too, and think it might be because of the moisture from the fog and take them off. That's when I realise that I can hear a hissing sound. It's not a normal sound that you would hear from electric interference, it's almost like an animal making it, but I've never heard it before, and my heart drops. The feeling of being watched overpowers me now. I feel darkness like I've never felt before, like true evil's around. I think maybe there's a park ranger there with his radio messing up. I call out, but I don't hear anyone. I suddenly think it is a bad idea to call out, and I begin jogging. As I start jogging, I hear a crash behind me. I turn to look, and there's a very tall, dark figure just off beside a tree. Now what terrifies me is that there's a tree that's been knocked over that was standing before. I know for a fact that it's either a 1 in a billion chance it fell then and none of the other trees did, or something menacing's following me. Now this thing has to be at least 6'2" and has long arms. It sounds like it's describing exactly me so far. I can't see any eyes, but I can tell that this thing's facing directly towards me. I wipe my eyes, and it doesn't move. I say, hey, if this is a ranger, you need to stop because I'm scared now. And I'm met with silence. It slowly moves behind the tree. I've seen enough now. I can't deal with this. I go into a fight or flight state and I'm literally frozen for a second. I tell myself, no, I'm not going out like this, and I start sprinting as quick as I can. The whole time I'm running, I can hear this thing chasing just behind me. I get to the car park and there's no other cars there, so it's me alone now. Great. So if this thing attacks me, I'm screwed. I jump into my truck and drive as quick as I possibly can, getting out of the wooded area. Now the craziest thing is, this thing's still following me. I can hear things breaking behind me, like a very tall and very heavy things chasing me through the woods. I'm literally screaming and praying for God to help me out in this moment. I can just about see him in my mirrors, but it's very foggy at the time. I have to slam on the brakes at one point too because I nearly hit a tree because how dense the fog had become. I continue driving and eventually make it back onto the main road. I'm literally crying the entire time. I end up going to a ranger station and explaining what I saw, and they say I'm not the only one that's reported something similar. People have been reporting it as a bear, but it's not possible because there's no bears in this specific area. I have no idea what it was, and nor do the park rangers, but they say I wasn't the only one who had that reaction. And there was a strange smell that accompanied that thing. I didn't get that close to find out, but everyone described it exactly the same as me. They're already doing patrols trying to find that thing, but they never found it. It still shakes me to my core thinking about it to this day. So this didn't happen to me, but I live in the area where it took place. My friend and I were discussing the scariest things that we've seen in the woods, and he told me a story that happened to his friend. So this guy was with 5 of his friends and was spending a few days in a cabin hunting and trapping. They were not drunk but had a few beers to unwind one night, so one of them goes out to the outhouse to use the bathroom. He can hear some faint beating sounds in the distance like a low drum. So he finishes in the outhouse and goes into the cabin to tell his friends to come and check out the sound. So they all grab their rifles and walk out the ridge of their cabin, down the holloway behind it and up the other side. It's a pretty rocky area, so the sound travels far. They could tell that it's just over the hill, so 5 of them spread out about 50 feet and walk up to the top. They can't see completely over there because there's large bushes around them. Now, they just sneak down and try and see what it is. One of them goes over there, and he stands there and watches for about 30 seconds to a minute, before telling his friends that they have to run as quick as they can, and saying what he saw was evil and they need to get out of there now. He said all he could see was a bunch of naked people dancing around a fire pit with some kind of pentagram on the floor. He never told them about everything he saw. He just said he was too scared ever to go back in the woods again or near that area. I was born and raised in Charlotte, NC, and still live on the east side. There's a local public park near my parents' house called McAlpine Creek, which was mainly a large cross-country trail stretching miles across East Charlotte. The park is enveloped by hundreds of acres of dense forest and underdeveloped land that is discreetly placed amidst busy streets and highways. You almost don't realise it because of the stretches of infrastructure around it. There's a myth and folklore tale about a devil church or satanic ritual area deep within that park. There's a few videos of people trying to find it. Now in my senior year of high school, after searching around the internet, I heard about where this is supposed to be and decided I want to find it. So my girlfriend and I at the time decided to try and find it on the road that leads into the church. We end up driving down miles of winding roads behind a Carmax that borders the dense woods of the park where a small neighbourhood of sorts is. I think I gotten the two street names wrong, but they're very close to the spot. Now, cautiously driving down these quiet and dark roads, we found a seemingly abandoned dirt track offshooting from the paved road. Keep in mind that there's almost no streetlights anywhere. We're driving about another 2 or 3 minutes, and there had been a pickup truck behind us for maybe 50 feet or so. Upon seeing the dirt track and everything else around, our interest had peaked. We stopped the car to discuss what we want to do. We began to slowly pull onto the dirt track simultaneously. The pickup truck ahead abruptly stops and stays in place. We notice this, having pulled finally into the dirt road at this point. We're immediately frozen in panic. The driver of the truck quickly puts their car into reverse and began to immediately back up towards us at max speed. I throw my car into reverse and panic in an attempt to back away from where we come from. I was able to get turned around and drive back into the woods fairly quickly. The driver's accelerating at us at full speed now, and I have to floor it to try and get out of there. We literally never look back. We never ended up finding the church and have no idea who was following us in the woods that day. I'm not sure if this is the right place for this, but when I went to high school in a small Minnesota town, mostly farmland intersected by wooded areas, and of course dozens of small lakes. One side of my neighborhood was bordered by a relatively large marshland that you could access by a slope that wound down a trail. This trail curves through the marsh into a big patch of woods, about 3/4 of a mile away. In the fall or spring, after heavy rain, a fog would often settle over the marshes, as it was much lower than the surrounding area. It really looks like something out of a Stephen King novel. After one of these rains, my brother and I, he's probably about 13 and I was 16 at the time, decided it's a great idea to explore the woods in the fog. Although the sun was setting fast, we knew that we could make it into the woods in about 10 minutes if we left immediately. We grabbed a couple of flashlights, knowing that it would get dark by the time we got home, and we head for the trail. Once we're in the trail and moving, it hit us just how thick the fog is. We'd only been walking for about a minute or two, but we have absolutely no visibility behind us, and 5 to 10 feet max in front of us. So we continue walking for a few more minutes, now we come up to a curve in the trail. This curve signaled that we're only about 100 yards from the entrance of the woods. At this point, there's a small lake on the left side of the trail and some marshland further to the right. Now we began walking past the lake when we hear a splash. Definitely much bigger than a fish jumping, almost like a person done it. It's a really strange sound. Now we couldn't have been up there for more than 15 seconds when we heard cracking and shuffling in the brush up ahead to our left. We stopped dead in our tracks and waited. At the end of our eyesight, which could only have been about 10 feet, a figure steps out from the brush bordering the fog. Now, it's so thick that we can't make out details, but he must have been about 6'4" and very broad-shouldered. As this figure made its way into the middle of the trail, my brother gasped and stopped. Its head shot over and looks right at us. It felt like it must have been an eternity, but it couldn't have been more than a few seconds. I felt true terror in that moment that I've never felt before. I began to take a small step backwards, and suddenly, the figure took over into the marshland running again. There were no houses or buildings or anything for miles in the direction that we ran. We kept on sprinting until we got back home, and we never went back to that area again. I grew up in the Midwest US. When I was a senior in high school, I was out for a hike at a local trail in the National Forest. This is a good 20 miles from town, way out in the sticks. It's a box canyon, so you start at the rim and hike down into the canyon. It was autumn, and late afternoon when I pulled into the empty parking area, but there's plenty of light around. But by the time I got to the bottom, the sun's pretty low. I was down in the canyon and get the feeling that something isn't quite right. I start looking behind me as I walk every few steps. I can't shake this feeling. Finally, on one of these backward glances, I spotted a man peeking out from behind a tree, not far at all, maybe 100 feet away. It was the weirdest thing to catch somebody watching me. He knew I'd seen him and stepped out saying, "I'm not looking to scare you." He's a big adult male, very old looking, and I'm a scrawny 16-year-old kid, and we're on a trail in the public park. There's no reason to hide like that. He seems alarmed that I've even seen him. The only reason he was out there is if he's weird. I mumble something about getting back to my car, and this horrifying grin comes across his face. He's just standing there staring at me. I'm running for a long time and I can still tell that he's watching me. And when I get back to the parking area, there's no cars other than mine, which added to the weirdness. I realised later that he must have been out there for some time because of the state of his clothes. It's interesting how when you get the sensation that you're being watched, it's normally true. I have no idea what his intentions were. I'm just really glad that I was aware of what was going on and he didn't spring up on me, because I don't know what he was capable of. I went to a summer camp in a rural part of New Jersey back in the mid-1990s. The camp was situated on a long, narrow man-made lake. One end of the lake was reserved for swimming, which we'd do as a group activity every day or so. The swimming area had one long dock stretching straight out onto the water. The two square floating docks further apart. One of the two floating docks is further away, and although I had spent a few summers at this camp, I'd never seen anybody use the second dock. One day on the group, a dozen 11-year-olds got to the bright idea that we're going to swim out to the faraway dock. I consider this to be a challenge. When we reached the dock, I noticed a strange looking spider on the ladder that you had to climb up. I would have a heart attack. It was quite large, in terms of overall footprint. Probably 3 inches from end to end. Nah, screw that. Spiders, of course, are normal critters in nature, but this one stood out as looking unusual. After the long swim, we took a few minutes to lie on the dock and rest in the sun. No way did they just go over that spider like that. It was relaxing and we were all having a good time. We started really messing around and decided to play around for a bit. We're playing a regular game where we shuffle towards one corner of the dock, making it sink. Oh god. As the corner of the dock starts to sink and fill with water, suddenly hundreds of giant spiders come, frantically crawling out from between the boards, swarming over around the feet of those who are still standing on the dry ground. This dock was theirs apparently. We all began to scream immediately and jump up trying to get away, but the spiders are in the water too. I vividly remember the feeling of them clinging to my wet hair as I began hopelessly trying to get them off. Adrenaline kicks in and we swim to the other side that's spider free. But this is a childhood trauma that lingers with me. I had not really been afraid of spiders before, but this is a turning point. The thought of us lying on the dock in the sun, unaware to how many of them were there, creeps me out to this day. That is literally hell on earth. Okay, so I have no idea exactly what I saw that night. I have searched everywhere for sightings or even myths around the area we saw it, and I found nothing. If anyone has any idea what we saw, or even if anyone else has seen it, please let me know. My husband and I think it could be a Wendigo, but I'm not sure. Now, my friends and I go camping a lot. Our favourite place is Red River Gorge, Kentucky. We go there so often, and I've been there since I was an infant. I'm 28 now, married with a kid and still go. It is the closest place to where I live that you can actually see the Milky Way pretty much all the time. It's perfect to stargaze, and I've seen a shooting star every clear night that I've been there. When we go without our kid, we will night hike to a good lookout point and stargaze for hours. Our first experiences night hiking, we would go to the trails we knew well, and were used to frequenting during the day. Now the most used trail in the area is one that's known as the Natural Bridge Trail. The trail is around 2 miles uphill depending on your starting point. I've done this trail every summer of my life and could do it blindfolded. It has wooden steps, carved rock steps, long handrails, multiple sitting points under a roof, trash cans, and after reaching the main trail, there's no lights. It's often used, and while it's an uphill one, the difficulty is low. As long as you have a good grip on your shoes and water, you'll be fine. My friends and I have literally done this multiple times, and are confident in it as well. Hiking this trail at night is not allowed, but it's in the woods and I've never really been to one that I've cared about closing times. When we use this main trail to hike to the top, we will park in a lot designated for the pool and Hoden Island. You walk across the road that leads to the pool, and you're at the first trail marker. You go up the gravel for a while and past the Natural Bridge State Park Lodge. There's actually a waterfall and some lights. It's always best to go fast and watch out for rangers that would tell us to leave. Then you walk across another road and there's a mini shelter to sit on, or a small rock wall that you can rest on. That night, things are normal to begin with. As soon as we started the hike, the clouds took over and it appeared as though we'd been walking for nothing because we can't even stargaze. But we went anyway just in case it cleared out by the time we get up there. In the beginning, it was just normal paranoia that was keeping us stressed and quiet it seemed. You know, you've reached the bottom of the bridge when you see a giant limestone wall. During this time, there was a gazebo that sat to the right of this wall, and the trail continued and followed next to the wall. Where you come from is a fairly steep part of the trail, and the gazebo is welcomed. My husband, my best friend at the time, and I all sit on top of the gazebo. We're all facing down towards the limestone wall now. We each have an LED headlamp and a headlight. We don't usually look at each other because it's blinding, so we sit in a line, like the Lord's Supper, and walk in a line or staggered not to blind ourselves. It is after hours at this point. No ski lift riders have gone for hours and the rangers had already done their sweep, so they're heading back, but we're obviously not. We ended up leaving in no time though, and making sure the trail at the top was clear for our hike up. The ski lift takes you to the top, but there are workers that stay and do counts and only leave once it's clear. I guess I have to make these points because that's what I was thinking when what seemed out of nowhere, a girl with a headlamp appears, beginning to walk down the trail staring at us. She's in a sundress and flip-flops. The hike's uphill, and while it's easy, you don't want to do it without water or real shoes. She'd have to hike up and down to this point with no food or water. Her light was bright, and when she reaches where the trail turns from in front of the gazebo down to where she comes from, she stops. And she just stands there, kind of eerie. She's looking directly down at us. Her light made my hand light up. Now she doesn't turn away from our lights at all or even react to them. I say hello. She said kind of what sounds like hello, how are you? But I can't make out what it is. I said something like good, and you? She pauses for what feels like an eternity and says, oh, I'm fine. She then just stood there with her hands to the side of her, staring at us. Her light made it impossible to really see her face, and it was so bright I have to put my hands up the entire time. She eventually walked away and slowly turns down the trail. She got to the part where the trail turned and we saw her light just stay in that one spot for a minute, then fading. We wait for a while before continuing up. I kept making comments about how weird that was, and everyone else just made it out to be as though I'm being afraid. But no one ever come after her, which is kind of funny. But she had done this hike alone at night, and I wasn't sure why. Somehow she hasn't even been detected by any of the park rangers. We got up after a bit and started walking back to the top. It felt like it took much longer than it ever had before in the past, but we make it to the top. There's stones, and they're kind of steep and named Fat Man Squeeze. They get you over to the top of the bridge, and you can walk across it and whatever. Going up and being on the top, we hear twigs snapping, almost alternating from left and right. We lay down and try and stargaze, but the clouds are thicker now, and it's miserably hot. We could hear voices at the same time, and my husband kept checking for people. He never saw anyone. We saw a light flash, but nobody near it. And then a bird call. But it wasn't like a real bird, almost like a person imitating one. Like rhythmic and not so much natural, if that makes sense. I was convinced that we weren't alone, and hadn't been alone for a while now. I ask if we can leave as soon as possible, and everyone agrees. We began going down the way that we come from, and it felt like it was taking an eternity. We were going steady and quick, and it was downhill, but we're not making any ground, it seemed. It's hard to explain, but it was weird. I even said aloud, "This feels much longer than it should be," and they agree with me. I kept looking behind me with the flashlight, and my husband kept looking out to the sides, and my friend kept hers mostly forward. I kept feeling watched and can't figure out what footsteps are ours or the others. I would turn around in the direction of a noise and see nothing. When my husband was walking, he kept saying he was catching eyes with something in his flashlight. Usually you can see a raccoon spying on you, but not this time. He's afraid maybe it's a big dog or bear. And I could never see it when he did. Now, we're hiking down semi-panicking on a kind of flattish area compared to the normal downhill areas that we're used to. The log fence or handrail, whatever it's called, is on our right. We are in a row walking within reaching distance from the barrier, and my husband just stops walking altogether and says, "What's that?" But the question is more of an alert. I move my headlamp in the direction that he's pointing to and see nothing. But then, both of his lights catch a shape. My headlamp catches the shape too. It's almost simultaneous. All lights fixate on this grey creature. It is bent in a crouching position, knees facing out to the right, turning towards us. It starts to slowly stand, and my mind is racing. It looks human, but it's far too big. People mistake human shapes for what's actually bears in the woods, but this is shiny. It's thin and big, almost like it's too big and too grey. There's a shine to it, and our lights reflect it even more. It gradually comes to a standing position. Its head is long, and its eyes are in a human position, but it's not human whatsoever. It doesn't have normal eyes, just big empty holes. It looks directly at us. The way it stood up was intimidating, almost like it was a snake, and it appears smart. It was like it was stepping up to a fight, from crouching to accepting a challenge. Its hands had to be by its knees. It must have stood about 8 or 9 feet tall. No hair whatsoever, and its head was large. I can't process what I saw, and I was frozen. Then, I can just feel my husband hitting me saying, "Run, please." I start to understand that we have to get away from this thing, and it pivots and runs to the right, going backwards on the trail so it could get around the barrier and onto the trail behind us. We take off the rest of the way running down the trail, knowing that this thing could take off so much quicker than us and get to the barrier so quick. We didn't talk much at all because we felt so scared. We kept running as far as we could. It never felt like we're even out of sight of this thing, let alone reaching distance. As we made it to the trail beginning with the gravel, we could hear something to the right side crashing down through the forest. We run to the road and get to the car, driving off as quick as we possibly can. When that thing looked at us, I knew immediately it was much stronger, smarter and faster than us. I knew that if we hadn't seen it, it could have taken one of us at least. I think it only hesitated because there's such a big group of us. When we made it back, we were all terrified, trying desperately to figure out what we saw, but none of us can make sense of it. I was born and raised in the hills of eastern KY, about 10 miles from Hazard. When I was about 14 to 15, my cousin and I went hiking, going to the top of one of the mountains. We followed a trail, sometimes almost straight up, and what we saw terrifies both of us. We had been walking for about an hour and a half when we saw a man and woman's clothes on a tree limb. That might not sound strange, but we were far from people, and the branch was at least 30 feet off the ground. The clothes were neatly draped over the branch like they'd been not thrown up there. We ended up going further, and eventually found a flat area. There's no trees, no grasses or flowers. Now, off to my left, I remembered seeing a black hole in the air. Not shiny, like the mouth of a cave, just black. It was 8 foot tall and 3 feet wide, and kind of misty around the edges. Seems like every year the memory fades a little, so the next thing I remember is tearing down the side of the mountain as quick as possible, not following the trail, just trying to get away from whatever it was. To this day, I have no idea what it was, but I'm sure there was a connection between the people's clothes missing and that. I've been lurking here for a few months, but decided to tell my story finally. My family and I are from Oakland, CA. It was 2012, I was 16 and my brother was 12, and my parents are both in their mid-50s. One summer, we were on a road trip and ended up camping in the mountains above Lander, WY. I remembered sitting in the back seat behind my dad who was driving. We're on a dirt road above Sinks Canyon. All of the windows are open. It's July and really nice out. We pulled over by the turnout to one of the lakes to the right of us to take a look at the map. My parents weren't sure about how to get to the campground on the other end. It's quite a few miles away. About this time, a young lady came jogging from the other direction. I remembered she was blonde, had a yellow tank top and dark shorts. My dad waved out the window to call to her. He said we're lost and said, "Do you know the area?" "Yeah, sure do, if you keep following this." She mentions, "It will take you to Louise Lake. The campground's to your left." We thank her and she says she's Amy. Anyway, a few years later, I see an episode of Disappeared that featured a young runner who had gone missing in the 90s outside of Lander, WY, and I immediately get chills. Apparently she was never found. They show her picture, and the hairs on the back of my neck immediately stood up. It's her, and her name's Amy. When we saw her, she appeared to be the same age, even wearing the same clothes in the program. I showed my dad a few days later, but he didn't remember specifics. He remembered her being called Amy, but that was it. My brother was asleep when this happened, and my mum had no comment. But I know what I saw. It was Amy. Now, I'm not religious, which makes this story harder for me to understand, but the rest of my family is, and for some reason, my mum and dad were still together, and they prayed when riding the bus. That was just a habit they had. We lived in Finland out in the woods a bit, and strange things aren't really that common here. This happened before I was born. I was in the womb. My mum and dad got on the bus, and noticed a tall, slim, dark thing sitting behind the driver. It's wearing all black robes. Now they can see because it's darker where the tree line is, and it almost stands out as being pitch black compared to the surroundings. To this day, they don't know if it was male or female. They sat a couple of seats behind the thing, and as usual start praying. My mum noticed the head of the thing start to shiver and jolt lightly. She didn't mind it, but the more she prayed, and the further into the forest the bus drove, that thing seemed to get more agitated. My mum shivers when she speaks about it. She has had so many nightmares about this thing. My mum started getting a weird feeling. My dad didn't care as much, he's used to weirdos, but the jolting intensifies, and the long greasy hair, barely holding on the top of the head, starts whipping. The thing then starts growling and hissing. Suddenly, it stopped. Its head turns all the way around and stared with its soulless and dark eyes straight to my mum. A wave of panic overtook her as she started frantically pressing the stop button. They get off and my dad said, "What is it?" My mum explained the whole thing, but my dad brushes it off. Said that there's full of weird people on this bus. But here's a kicker. My mum often has visions, and they're often true. She once saved a guy from committing suicide and had a vision of his chair he was sitting on just before he jumped off a roof. She also saw his face in the vision. She knew where he was going to jump. He said afterwards that he told God that if somebody doesn't speak to him, he'll die. Back to the story. My mum saw a vision of the thing standing in front of their door, and she freaked out and refuses to go home. But my dad, in his nature, dragged my mum along and ensured her it's going to be alright, and how ridiculous the vision is. I bet you know where this is going. They got home, and sure enough, the thing was right there, right in front of their door. They freaked out, ran for their lives, and escaped into a bar calling the priest. He said that under no circumstances did they touch or even go near that thing ever. They waited in the bar for hours and finally noticed the thing's gone. They then had the priest come and purify their house. I went out hiking into the wilderness on the outskirts of Yuma and walked about 5 miles from my car to my campsite. I brought my usual hiking gear along, as well as my AR-15 for protection against wild animals like coyotes and snakes. My firewood supply burned up just after the sun went down. I went to bed at 18:30. I messed around on my phone until 19:30, passed out, and I'm then woken up by a call by my friend. Now it's around 8:30, and I fell asleep again. The next time I woke up, I couldn't move. I could hear rocks moving around outside and soft footfalls in the sand right outside my tent. I heard coyotes howling louder earlier, so I know that's what they were. I was sleeping with my back against the wall, and one of them idiots presses their noses in my back and sniffs me for a good few minutes. The second thing that happened was around 0300. This is a nightmare. Not sleep paralysis this time. There are 2 sections in my tent that can be seen through. It had to be a dream, but I woke up, peered through the window, and I saw a young woman and child sitting outside my tent on a small rise, no more than 6 feet away. I asked who they are. The child was silent, but the woman declared, "Leave now." They made a horrifying face. I was able to grab my gun. I tried to shoot them, because it dawned on me that something was terribly wrong. The trigger wouldn't budge. She then stood up and walks into the shrubs. The woman walks away until I can't see her anymore, but the child passed out from under the moonlight into the shadow of the shrub tree, and because the moonlight was falling on the other side of the tree, all I could do is watch her silhouette change shape. She'd become a gnarly, bony freak, almost like a tall monkey. Absolutely silently, she rushed my tent. I squeezed the trigger for all that I'm worth. She collides with my tent. In that instant, I'm throwing punches everywhere, and everything goes back to normal. Now, the crazy thing too is on the way back, I find there's scratch marks all over my car and on the back of my arms. I've never had anything like this before in my life.